Hello and welcome to this session where you, the audience, can ask questions on aquaculture. And we have two great experts today to guide this discussion. We have Allan LeBlanc, Vice President of Aquaculture at Calysta, which produces alternative fish feed, and Mike Velings, who is Managing Partner at Aqua-Spark, a fund that invests in aquaculture. My name is Elizabeth Sukkar. I'm a Managing Editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit. So welcome and thank you for joining me today. Let's start with a big question around this topic. I mean, food security is a big issue. I mean, nearly 500 million metric tons of animal meat will be required to feed the world's population in 2050. And so aquaculture has a really big role to play. So Mike, I mean, which countries or regions do you think are seeing the greatest value in this industry, and who's actually acting on it?
It's a great question. It's also a little hard to predict. 2050 is far away, but first of all, I think that Asia will benefit greatly from this development because they're already producing 80% of the world's aquaculture production, and a lot of the improvements and expansions that will happen there the first, because it's easy to expand something that you already have, even though it's because it's not just a space requirement, it's also new technology and better ways of working. And I think a lot of that technology will come from the West. I think Africa will really benefit if there's enough investment. There's tremendous potential. And South America, I think Brazil, not really acting upon it, but Brazil has tremendous potential to become the next powerhouse of aquaculture. And then I'm not so much talking about land-based salmon and developments that you also see in the US, etc., which is big, but it's just a small percentage of global aquaculture.
And Allan, do you agree with that as well?
I do. I'd say Asia is really the place where I see the most growth. Places like India have seen extraordinary growth in their shrimp output. China, you don't see so much growth. It's shifting from lower value species to higher value species. So, it's a country that makes 2/3 of the world's aquaculture products. A lot of those are carp today. And as the country focuses on, fresh water quality, you're seeing some of those carp farms shut down. But at the same time, you're seeing really explosive growth in high value marine finfish and offshore aquaculture.
And do you think there's kind of a different shift between the US and Europe and Asia, kind of cultural attitudes towards this whole? I mean, fishing, there's a lot of patriotism associated with this. I mean, does that play into it as well? Maybe Mike, have you any thoughts on that?
You mean whether it culturally plays into whether cultural attitudes are changing towards aquaculture? Is that what you're asking?
And fishing as well, whether that will kind of shift more towards the aquaculture.
I do think so, and especially with younger generations, you see that people are getting a bit more educated and know more about aquaculture, have a different attitude towards fishing, which has been largely romantic in the past, and people are starting to realize that it's not just romantic and that the future needs to be something different. And people are starting to realize that we can do that in a really great way. So a great sign of changing attitude, which is the amount of young talent that's been flowing into the aquaculture industry globally in the last, say, 8 years or so. And I think that's a great sign of changing attitudes. And it's a precursor of what's going to happen afterwards, I think.
Okay, and this is something when I was doing pre-reading on this whole subject, there's salmon in Norway and Scotland, and there's tilapia in Latam. And we just got a good question now that's come from the audience. Do you see aquaculture expansion in other species besides the typical ones? Are we going to have a more diverse species? And also, just to add my own question on top of the audience question, there is how expensive is it to invest in a new species as well?
Well,
yeah, I think you are going to see some expansion in that some of the species which have production today, but maybe not on a global scale, they're going to grow into that. Whether that's yellowtail hamachi in Japan, or eel as the sushi demand continues to grow, or more esoteric species like snakehead and yellow croaker that you see produced in China, but not necessarily anywhere else. But at the same time, it's a lot of investment to understand what the nutritional requirements are for new species, to understand what the appropriate feeding measures are, and also breeding. I mean, a lot of these species spawn in the wild, and some of these still require us to catch larval fish and then raise them up to market weight. And so there is a lot of investment that goes on that's already been done in salmon, shrimp, and tilapia, which is why you see that kind of large scale continued growth.
Mike,
But
please
that's also why, yeah, because for us, this is one of our core things to focus on as an investment fund, and trying to influence the course and the way aquaculture is going to develop going forward, and how that growth is going to develop. And there's about somewhere between 600 and 700 species being farmed, including plants and shellfish. And we think that diversity is really unique and really important. If we start to focus on and do this in the same way as we've done other industries and create chicken, we're on the wrong path. Alan's right, though. It really requires significant investment, and a lot of the arguments, especially around genetics, until recently really held true. Where we do Atlantic halibut on land in Norway, for example, and it doesn't spawn until 7 or 8 years in. If you want to do a traditional genetic selection process over 10 generations to select the best animals, it's a century. And then you realize you forgot something, you have to start anew. That's not gonna work. So, but with modern day technology, where we can actually do way more effective, much faster genetic selection, we think we can preserve diversity. And it's one of our core attention points where we want to invest to make sure that we keep doing that, because it's not only viable, it's necessary, but without relying on wild broodstock.
Thank you for that, Mike. And please do send in your question for our expert panel. We've just received another one here, very, very specific question. And Mike or Alan, see if you want to answer this one. It says, I'll read it out. I've read about carbon sequestration method called ocean pasture restoration, created by iron fertilization, similar to volcanic dust. Is that being used for aquaculture anywhere today? Mike or Alan, who would like to start on that, if you can?
Not to my knowledge.
I'm familiar with. Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with the concept, but I'm not aware of it anywhere. I think something that maybe is similar is large scale seaweed farming kind of takes advantage of the nutrients already in the water column, as do things like mussels and oysters, which can be very carbon negative in their production.
Okay. Thank you for that. So we have another question from the audience. I'll just read it out. In your opinion, what would be the best sustainable approach to kick off smaller aquaculture projects in place with weak supply chain for good conditions, like small island nations, to potential, make them grow and scale up? Really interesting question, actually. And I'll probably add a question on top of that, because if this sector is to grow, because there's quite a lot of fragmentation, I'm just curious to see how it will become more globalized and more vertically integrated, and if that's a good or bad thing. But hopefully the audience question first there. Maybe Mike, you'd like to start us?
Yeah, I think there's different elements to this, and it's I think as small island nations, it also depends a little bit on market and where that market is. Is that around the same small island nations, or is it going to be a very long value chain somewhere else? Then it really depends on what type of species and what you can do to sustainably generate a cold chain and to get fish or products to market. Could be seaweed. And that might actually be one of the most viable options to do, but it really depends. It's there's not a single silver bullet that says, well, hey, this is what you should do in this in island nations in general. It really depends. If you have lagoons, you can do sea cucumbers. If you have deep water, you have to do something else. If it's cold water, it's different than when you have tropical waters. It's a very difficult question to answer.
Okay. Allan, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think there are a couple challenges. One can be government supported in the sense of having a local hatchery that enables an industry to build around that species. But it's hard to solve the requirement to import feed. And if you're doing fed species, you have to do that. And I think, single cell proteins, algae, insect proteins can all be ways to try and locally produce feed ingredients. But that could really be a challenge, regardless of solving everything else.
Great, thank you.
That's also why I would say that seaweeds might be potentially one of the best options. Anyway,
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
And we've got another question now, and this is looking at, is there a way to promote biodiversity in aquaculture to ensure that an aquaculture farm isn't wiped out by a single incident? That's an interesting one. Mike, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there's a few ways to look at this. You could look at it from a farm perspective, and then yes, you see, for example, multi-species farms, multi-trophic systems where you have seaweed feeding off the runoff of the fish, etc., which could deliver a more sturdy system. However, that being said, it's very hard to make it work economically. Or you look at it from a more macro perspective, which is what we do, and say, well, hey, that means that we need to have a lot of different farms with different species to have a really sturdy global food system. That still means that a single farm could be wiped out from something. And you can mitigate for that by making sure that you have the best siting, best practices, at low stocking densities, really clean water, the best ways to treat your fish and protect from prevent disease, keep them really healthy. It's basically really the quality of the farming operation that protects you best in the end, aside from the biodiversity.
Thank you, Mike. And so there's a question here. This is kind of looking at more about the public perception, I guess, about aquaculture and maybe outreach around this. So do maybe one for you, Allan. Do you think aquaculture should be taught in schools? That's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think it could benefit from being presented alongside traditional agriculture. I mean, it is taught in universities in the United States. You can go to University of Arizona, Auburn, University of Florida, Miami, and get an aquaculture degree. It's much more common in Europe. There's some world leading universities in Scotland and the Netherlands and Belgium, but it is still a niche, and it's something that people maybe don't think about. But at its core, it's been around almost as long as agriculture, because the history of this industry is really raising freshwater fish in rice farms in Asia. And so I think the more awareness people have of it, the more they see it like a traditional agricultural process as opposed to something different and unique.
And Allan, if I can just add my own question on this, because it is a pretty niche industry. And so what do you think needs to be done now, kind of almost to mitigate against any possible adverse scenarios? Like, I don't want to say scare stories, but that might come out of this sector, because a lot of people don't understand the sort of feeds that go into the fish. I mean, it's insects or methane guzzling bacteria that like your company produces. And I'm kind of thinking a little bit about other industries, other protein industries like the beef industry and what happened with BSE and variant Creutzfeldt Jakob disease. I mean, what lessons can you learn from other industries here? And what your thoughts on that, Allan?
Yeah, I think it is. It's something aquaculture has dealt with for a long time, and I think in general been too defensive and not positive enough when they communicate with the public. Because on all of these issues, whether it's antibiotics or local environmental impacts, these are the same things that any economic activity or any animal production system runs into. But there is an emotional connection to the ocean and to clean water and to that kind of spiritual or emotional relationship to fishing that Mike kind of referenced earlier, right? And it's been unfortunate that people have pitted fishing versus aquaculture when largely they don't compete. They're at different price points. They're different species of fish. People aren't choosing one over the other. So yeah, I don't know that there's any ag industry that's necessarily nailed it, but I think in general, education and positive stories are way more persuasive than the defensiveness and trying to fight back against critics.
Okay, all right, Mike. Any thoughts about any mitigation of possible adverse scenarios in the future?
Yes, we need different ways well, first of all, I think a healthy alternative feed ingredients will help, and it's not just from a disease perspective, but also from a breakdown of supply chains along the way in the feed ingredient space and sustainability. We need better ways to prevent and cure disease, and in general, have more education on best practices and improve the ways we do farming in aquaculture the way we do today. Even though it's already better than other animal sectors, we think we can improve quite significantly.
Okay, great. And we've got a few questions, obviously, from people who are quite keen to invest in this sector, and maybe I'll put them together. One is quite specific. If I had 1 million to invest in aquaculture and I want a 3% return, but also to support the SDGs, principally ending hunger and creating decent work, where should I invest it? I think, Mike, that one's a good one for you.
Yeah. It's a well, it's a question that well, I would say if you would have 1 million to invest in aquaculture, you should want a return that's a bit higher than 3%, significantly higher actually. And if you can, you should diversify it across a few companies in this space. And it can be in an investment fund such as ours. There's a few that in this space that are active. You could invest it in a single company, which is a bit more risky. But I would definitely want, you don't need to give up a return potential, and that's the beauty of aquaculture, to find a really great opportunity to invest where you can support the SDGs and do something really, really great and support a really great development and have a good financial return. And there's no reason to say, well, hey, I only want 3%. It should be 20 plus, something like that.
Okay, Mike, we'll have to invest with you then. You know which ones are the good companies. Let's move away from investment for just a bit, because and Allan, maybe you can look at this more kind of like local communities, and there's a big issue as well. If we're going to be seeing consolidation in this industry, if it's quite fragmented, but this question is, what is the potential for small scale aquaculture systems that can benefit local communities? Allan, have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have to say, small scale aquaculture is not an area of expertise for me. I think in general, the industry is consolidating and benefits from consolidation. There's no efficient, productive agriculture system in the world that is made up of thousands of smallholder farmers. And I think generally the farmers that, the fragmented shrimp farmers, for example, are doing quite well. But, as those things are consolidated, they become more efficient and they become more profitable, and it supports the local community. So while I see, yes, small scale agriculture, like it's a great sustainable development project. But, maybe we should have somebody from the FAO on here to talk about that.
Yes, we don't have them. But Mike, do you have anything to add?
Oh yeah. I wholeheartedly disagree with Allan. Actually, I think aquaculture is a place where smallholders actually can really thrive, but the system today, in a lot of cases, is not set up for that. So in a lot of cases, finance is really hard to retain. It's very difficult to get direct access to market. There's a lot of middlemen because of the fact that you're small, but that's where we see technology solutions making a really, really big difference. Earlier today, e-fishery was mentioned, for example, in Indonesia, which has more than 4 million farms, 14 million fish ponds. They make automated feeders that sense when the fish are hungry or when the shrimp are hungry, and feed accordingly. That platform allows for a smallholder farmer now to get direct finance from Indonesian banks against commercial normal rates instead of hidden slavery rates. They have direct access to market in Jakarta, get their fish to the market with 2 middlemen instead of 8 middlemen. And there's 24% less feed use. Income almost triples. And they get a call like, hey, your feed is running out. Shall I come by this afternoon and bring you some? And the scale, all of a sudden, what you see, whether they have 1 pond or 100 ponds, becomes a lot less relevant. And all of a sudden, all of these businesses start to thrive like they haven't seen in decades. And that's more technology driven than that it's scale and consolidation driven. And I actually think that in shrimp, consolidation is the wrong answer. Because of the fact that it's so susceptible to disease, it doesn't work from a financial point of view. That's also why you see that the largest shrimp companies on earth are aggregators. They farm themselves, but the majority of their product comes from somewhere else, smallholders.
Thank you, Mike. We've got a really good question now, kind of shifting the conversation, kind of looking at what are the upcoming trends in data use, which would be really good to look at. Big data, AI, machine learning, and where could that all operate? Fish health and welfare, pests, disease mitigation or monitoring, I guess, production efficiencies. What are your thoughts on the use of big data? Allan, do you want to start us off there?
Sure. It's like all industries, big data right now is making impacts in aquaculture today. An example might be from sighting. So, the U.S., the National Fisheries Service provides sighting services that are very much based on big data of currents and wind conditions and historical patterns to know where is a sustainable site where there aren't going to be local environmental impacts. Similarly, there are companies in Norway that are counting sea lice with camera-based systems and even measuring shrimp growth in real time. And so all these things can help farmers be more efficient and at the same time, improve the profitability of the whole industry.
Thank you, Allan. And we've got a really good question, and this is something that must be debated often in aquaculture circles, looking at the two emerging movements, land-based versus offshore aquaculture. So, where is it heading? What are your views? Maybe, Mike, you want to start us there?
Yeah, it's a really great question. We think that both movements will be part of the answer. Land-based is a bit more developed than real offshore aquaculture. It's very hard to do and very hard to develop and very costly. The both, I think, really viable options. But it's they both have pluses and minuses. But I think offshore is something that's still a little less developed than the land-based farming operations. And then, but at the same time, these are really big trends that see a lot of investor influx, especially the land-based salmon operations, a lot of investment influx from the Nordics. People tend to forget that, in our opinion at least, the biggest wins are actually in pond farming, really traditional farming. Yeah.
Fantastic. Let's move the conversation to feeds now, which is a big sustainability issue in the sector. We have a really good question here on, alternative feeds. And Allan, hopefully you can answer this for us. I mean, how do you see the alternative protein space evolving in the coming years? And do you think, what will be the performance limitations or indicators in this area? It'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think, so we produce a single cell protein branded feed kind, and it's 70% protein and traceable and great in all fish species, but it does have max inclusion levels that vary by application. So shrimp love it. A more carnivorous fish might have a lower inclusion of 5 to 10%. So being realistic, these things aren't going to replace everything else in the feed pellet in the same way that soy protein came along and it didn't kick fish meal out completely. So I really see all of these different ingredients being used at the appropriate levels, whether that's where they optimize feed conversion, where the amino acids complement other ingredients in the feed formulation, and really where they can be most cost effectively used in the farm level. So I don't see any one company or one ingredient winning out at the expense of others, but we're in a situation where the pie is growing so fast. There isn't a lot of, I don't see myself competing against insect protein, right? We're both going to be winners if the industry is successful.
Okay, and Mike, what are your thoughts on the different options, the different protein feeds out there?
Yeah, I agree with Allan. A feed is made out of different components. It's never one component. Salt is necessary for you as a human being, but if you only eat salt, it's not going to be good for you. But without any salt, you're also not going to survive. So it's a combination of things. In our opinion, this is a place where we need potentially the most radical redesign of this whole industry, and because we think that feed needs to be radically redesigned if we ever want to reach real true sustainability. Animal feeds in general, probably, and in our minds and vision, a combination of single cell proteins, insects, seaweeds, microalgae would be the ideal solution. But we're miles and miles away from that. It's going to require billions, if not trillions, and decades to build, and let alone the amount of research that still needs to happen. It's a massive opportunity, but it's going to take a long time. If you look at how much money and capital is required to build 1 million tons of alternative proteins and how much time that's going to cost, then you can extrapolate that to a few 100 million tons and know how big the challenge is. That's also why Allan, for example, earlier today said about the IFFO and the fish meal industry. We're far from replacing anybody. We'd love to, eventually, but if today one of the current supply soy, fish meal, fisheries, if any of those streams fall away, we have a massive problem. It's not, but we're not really. There's place for everybody.
Thank you, Mike. And this is a really good question. This is kind of looking at the future of food. And maybe, Allan, this one would be a good one for you. Is the aquaculture industry concerned that the development of plant-based food, like that will mimic seafood, like Impossible Burger or Beyond Meat, will displace the marine products? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that it is an industry that's going to grow, and we're going to see those products on the shelves if they're not there already. I mean, there are some artificial tuna, things like that. But in the same way that I don't think Impossible Foods is going to replace all beef in the world, I don't think plant-based seafood is going to replace all seafood in the world. It's really something that is for high-income countries, and it's something for people who have a choice around what they want to eat. And for most of the world and most of the protein that's being produced, not everyone has that luxury. And at the same time, I think sustainably produced real aquaculture products from real fish are delicious, and they're healthy, and they're good for you. And personally, I don't see a need to replace those today.
Okay, well said. And we could probably just end on this last question now because we're coming close to the end of the session. Kind of a big question really here, and for both of you. Are humans sincere in their ocean activity so as to ensure food security within the food chain? Mike, do you want to briefly talk on that, and then Allan?
Well, we'd like to think so. It's not always the case, and we've seen quite a few examples where things have gone wrong. That's not always by intent. Sometimes it's also by lack of knowledge, or knowledge that we didn't have in the 80s when certain things were cited, for example. Most farmers that are directly involved, we think, are sincere, have to be sincere, otherwise you can't really be successful. There's a lot of work to do.
And briefly, Allan, then.
I would say that we certainly are, and I think most people I work with throughout the industry are sincere in the non-financial benefits of the industry as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Alan and Mike. That was fantastic insight. Thank you to our audience for your fantastic questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to go through all of them. There were so many great questions there. But don't worry. Join us tomorrow for the World Ocean Summit. It does continue. Thank you so much.